I think that from a starting point, I agree that we do live in an unsustainable world. I do agree that action has to be taken. There's nothing that points towards anything else. So all indicators are on the fact that if we don't change our ways, then we will we will be facing an irreversible process. Um, when I'm saying it's complicated, then it's also because I think that sustainability covers a whole range of issues. When the UN proposed their sustainable development goals, they were of course talking about the environment, but they were also talking about how we need to recognize that we are sharing the same fate, that we are in it together, right? But we also have to recognize the fact that we can't go on living in the same way as we did before. And it goes for all conditions in life. It's also the unsustainable economic system we created. It's the unsustainable consumption we created. It's the unsustainable approach to indigenous peoples and minorities and all these things. These are also a part of the sustainable development goals. I think that it becomes very apparent that we are still living in a world where power matters so much. For instance, right now in Brazil, they are facing challenges. They are having a new right-wing government. They are having new policies. We are looking at new environmental policies where they might actually be at risk of reducing the rainforest. But there's another power struggle going on, namely the idea that who is it? Who is in charge of this? Is it okay for countries in the northern hemisphere, in the global north, to run policies on behalf of Brazil? Is this a Brazilian issue? Of course, a lot of people say no, but it's a global issue because the Brazilian rainforest, the Amazonas, is so important to the biodiversity of the world, to the sustainability of the world. But there is another power struggle going on. We can't just assume control of the global south. We can't run policies. We can, of course, oppose to them. But I think there's an almost of political warmongering going on right now, which demonstrates another problem. I think that from one of the positive perspectives, for me at least, one of the most positive stories of last year was the development of a new knowledge center for indigenous peoples in Colombia. And as everybody knows, I have close ties to Colombia, my wife being Colombian, and a lot of family living there. And indigenous peoples in Latin America they have been under huge amount of pressure and to the verge where they were basically non-existent anymore. Their culture disappeared. Any trace of the narratives that could establish the foundation for understanding indigenous peoples basically disappeared. And for me, that was a very positive, sustainable story that we also come to realize that the only way to sort of create a sustainable world is to create a world in which we let the non-dominant understandings of the non-dominant narratives of the world get a space and get influence and get real power. So I think that I would like to do more. I think I'm also very hesitant on subscribing to a singular understanding of what a sustainable world implies. I'm simply not knowledgeable enough. I will go along with a lot of initiatives, and I've said to a lot of people, if you propose things and if you are more knowledgeable than me, I will go along with it. But I'm not willing to let go of everything. I'm not willing to let go of the other struggles, the other power struggles that are going on right now. I think they are as important, if not at least for me as an individual right here and now, more important. But I do recognize the fact, and I do acknowledge the fact that as a global community, we do have some pressing issues and concerns that we have to solve together. Of course, I know that you understand that, and I think that everybody who is interested, who has an actual interest in the continued process of making a more sustainable world for everyone. I mean, they are aware of the complexity of the problem. But I do think that sometimes we do resort to simplified measures and simplified ideas in which you are either with us or against us. If you were to ask in a very simplified way, are you with us or against us, as in, Are you sort of, do you want to go all the way to create a sustainable world, and maybe focusing sort of strictly environmentally speaking? Then I'm of course I will go along with that. I think that's a necessity. There are a lot of things that I haven't changed. I'm, for instance, still a meat eater, although I do know that meat and the meat consumption is a sustainable problem. On the other hand, I also changed a lot of different things. I drive much less than I used to in my car, for instance. I almost never buy new clothing or new furniture. I mean, in that sense, of course, I've also become more sustainable, much more sustainable than I was years ago. That doesn't mean that there are not still a whole range of things I can do, and I do know that, I mean, that's a responsibility. It's an individual responsibility that I need to find other ways and new ways of constantly improving. Uh, so in a very simplified fashion, I do think that we have to make some radical choices. Um, but I also think that radicalism in all its forms drives people away. And I don't think that right now we can afford to drive people away. Because if we are really, I mean, if we mean what we are saying, that we share each other's fate, that we either die and in this together, or we continue life in this together, then we need everybody on board. And this is not making excuses for we should just accept radical rantings, we should just accept radical policies. But I do think that there are much more at stake. I mean, we're also looking at economies right now that are new economies. I mean, politically speaking, economically speaking, we're looking at countries that have just gained their independence very short time ago, countries that are still struggling for independence. And for those countries and for those people who are, of course, not the worst environmental, I mean, they are not the ones contributing the most to the unsustainability of the world, but we need everybody on board. So I think that that's going to be a monumental task in the next many years, to convince those who are the most skeptical. It's probably not me who should be convinced, because I am actually convinced. I just need to do more, right? But there are people who are actually not convinced. There are still people who are publishing articles and essays and academic work, are basically trying to revoke the entire policy on environmental or the impact of our way of living on the environment today. So in politics, normally we work with different sort of ways of incentivizing populations and people, and there's sort of there's a general rule in politics, namely that it's almost impossible to convince people of doing something which is not in their own best interest. And there are people in this world for whom it is not in their own best interest, individually speaking, right here and now, to change their ways of living. And those people will be extraordinarily difficult to convince. I'll be easy to convince. And I'll probably also at some point, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not the day after tomorrow, I'll probably also at some point change a lot of things, maybe even including not eating meat anymore. Um, so for me, I don't have anything to lose. The only thing I have to lose is sort of my pride, if that's a thing. I don't have anything to lose. I mean, I'm insignificant when it comes to this. Um, but there are a lot of people who have a lot to lose, and I think that convincing those people will be the biggest challenge ahead. And it's also going to be a big challenge because they're also incredibly powerful, and they are sort of they are feeding a narrative in which they make it sound as if we are, by changing policies, actually destroying our entire way of living. It might be that we're saving our planet, but we're destroying ourselves in the process. Um, and that is, of course, also a very simplified way of saying it. But we resort to these simplified narratives.